Ridgeland, a small and quiet town in Mississippi, has always been distinguished by its regularity and safety. There have rarely been events here that could shake the local community, much less something so terrible that it could change the perception of life in the city. On the surface, it was the perfect suburban oasis, where everyone knew their neighbor and families lived on the same streets for generations. In this idealized world, it would seem that nothing foreshadowed trouble. Elizabeth Connor was a well-known and respected resident of Ridgeland. She maintained an active lifestyle into her 70s, and was always a warm, caring woman who helped her neighbors and maintained ties to her local church. Elizabeth lived alone in an old house on a quiet street, where every house is surrounded by greenery and manicured lawns. Her neighbors often saw her working in her garden or walking down the street with her grandson, 16-year-old Tyler. They were often seen together, and many commented on how close their relationship seemed. Everything changed one sultry August day, when the city was shocked by terrible news. It all started when the neighbors noticed something strange. Usually, every morning Elizabeth went out onto the porch to greet passers-by and water the flowers. But that day she was not visible. No one had seen her for several days, and this alerted a neighbor named Sarah Hudson. Sarah knew that Elizabeth was an old-school woman, always watching her routine, and such an absence seemed strange. Sarah decided to check in with Elizabeth to make sure everything was okay. When she approached the house, she was alarmed that the door was ajar. It was quiet inside, too quiet. Sarah called for Elizabeth, but there was no answer. An inner chill of anxiety penetrated Sarah's heart, and she, just in case, decided to call the police. A police patrol arrived at the scene a few minutes later. The officers who received the call weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary. After all, Ridgeland was a quiet town where only minor crimes usually occurred. However, when they entered Elizabeth's house, a terrible surprise awaited them. Elizabeth Connor's body was found in the living room, right on the carpet in front of the old fireplace, surrounded by scattered books and overturned furniture. There were clear signs of violent death on her body, numerous stab wounds. The police immediately realized that this was not an accident. The crime scene looked like a scene from a nightmare movie, completely inconsistent with the image of calm and safe Ridgeland. Shock and horror quickly spread throughout the city. The news that one of the most respected and elderly residents was killed in her own home shocked everyone. People began to remember the last time they saw Elizabeth and who she interacted with. Some remembered her grandson Tyler, who was often by her side. He was her favorite and was considered by many to be a good boy who took care of his grandmother. While the police were examining the crime scene, neighbors and city residents discussed what had happened in horror. They could not believe that such a brutal crime could happen in their peaceful town. There was anxiety, fear, and bewilderment in every home. Who could have committed such an atrocity, and what were the motives? This question will remain unanswered until the investigation is completed, but it was clear from the very beginning that this murder would change Ridgeland forever, leaving a deep scar in its history. Immediately after the discovery of Elizabeth Connor's body, investigating the crime became a top priority for Ridgeland police. City officials knew they needed to find the culprit as quickly as possible to calm the shocked community and prevent panic among residents. At such moments, even the most calm and comfortable city can turn into a place filled with fear and mistrust. First, detectives from the county police department arrived at the crime scene. They began to methodically inspect the house, each detail being examined with special attention. The living room where Elizabeth's body was found looked as if more than just a murder had taken place there. Shelves of books were overturned, broken vases and photographs lay on the floor, and furniture was overturned and scattered throughout the room. Everything indicated that there was a struggle here. This was the first serious indication that Elizabeth may have known her killer and tried to resist. Detectives carefully recorded all traces at the crime scene: fingerprints, traces of blood, scattered objects. They knew that every little thing could be the key to solving this mystery. When examining Elizabeth's body, multiple stab wounds were discovered, which indicated the extreme cruelty of the killer. This was not a random act of violence. This was cold-blooded murder. However, despite all efforts, detectives were faced with the fact that there were no obvious signs of forced entry in the house. The doors and windows were intact, which led them to believe that the killer might have known Elizabeth and entered the house without resistance. This fact only complicated the matter, since the circle of suspects could be very wide. The next part of the investigation included interviews with Elizabeth's neighbors and acquaintances. Detectives started with Sarah Hudson, the woman who first discovered that something was wrong. Sarah talked about her visit to the house and how she found the door ajar and complete silence inside. Her voice trembled with emotion, and she could not hide her fear as she described how she stood in front of the police, wondering what could have happened. Detectives continued canvassing the area in an attempt to gather as much information as possible. Neighbors described Elizabeth as a kind and calm woman who seemed to have no enemies. No one could remember that she had quarreled or had a conflict with anyone. Everyone who knew her stated that she was very close to her grandson Tyler. They often saw him at her house, and their relationship always seemed harmonious and warm. This sighting immediately caught the attention of detectives. Tyler was one of the first people they wanted to question. They knew that close relatives were often involved in such cases, and although the idea that a young boy could commit such a crime seemed absurd, the police could not rule out any possibilities. Tyler was called to the station for questioning. He looked like an ordinary teenager, tall, thin, with short blonde hair and a slightly withdrawn look. He was depressed and looked confused, which was only natural given the circumstances. However, his behavior during the interrogation aroused certain suspicions among the detectives. He avoided direct gaze and answered questions with a delay, as if he was carefully considering every word. Tyler said that he actually went to his grandmother's house the day before her death to help her with housework, as he did regularly. He claimed that he left early in the evening and did not see her again. Detectives noticed that he avoided discussing their relationship and tried to limit the conversation to general phrases. This made them feel like the guy was hiding something. However, there was no direct evidence against Tyler at that time. He was released, but detectives continued to closely monitor him. They began checking his alibi and trying to find clues that could confirm or refute his version of events. At the same time, investigators focused on analyzing evidence collected at the crime scene. Fingerprints were found on knives found in the house, which were expected to help identify the killer. Police were also checking footage from surveillance cameras in the area to determine who entered or left Elizabeth's home and when on the day of her death. The more detectives delved into the investigation, the more they realized that this case would not be simple. The evidence indicated that the crime was carefully planned, and the killer's motives remained a mystery. Each new detail of the case only increased the tension, and rumors and speculation began to be heard in the city. Residents of Ridgeland became more and more wary every day, suspecting anyone who might be involved in this terrible crime. The police understood that time was against them. The longer they could not find the culprit, the more mistrust and fear grew among the townspeople. The question of who could have committed such an atrocity and why remained open, and until it was answered, Ridgeland could not return to its former peaceful life. As the investigation continued, Elizabeth Connor's story began to take shape. Detectives and journalists covering the case gradually pieced together the pieces of her life, trying to understand what could have led to such a tragic ending. The more details surfaced, the more complex and confusing the picture became. Elizabeth Connor was a woman with a difficult life. Born and raised in Ridgeland, she has lived here her entire life, seeing the city change and evolve. She was married, but her husband, John Connor, died several years ago after a long illness. They had one son, Thomas, who moved to another state many years ago. Elizabeth was left alone in her house, which she and John built together. After her husband's death, Elizabeth's life became more secluded. She rarely left her home except for church and weekly doctor visits. However, despite her isolation, Elizabeth remained active in the community, keeping in touch with several neighbors and always ready to offer help to those who needed it. She often invited neighbors for tea and tried to keep her house and garden in order. Neighbors noted that Elizabeth was especially attached to her grandson, Tyler. Tyler moved in with his grandmother about a year ago after he had problems at school and at home. His father, Thomas, was unable to cope with his son's teenage difficulties, and it was decided that Tyler would be better off in Ridgeland under the care of Elizabeth. At first, this seemed like a reasonable decision. A quiet life in a provincial town, far from the temptations and problems of the big city, was supposed to help Tyler find himself and get back on the right path. However, their relationship was not as simple as it might seem from the outside. At first, everything went well. Tyler began attending a local school and his academic performance improved. He helped his grandmother around the house and in the garden, and they spent a lot of time together. But as the months passed, neighbors began to notice something strange. Sometimes their conversations on the porch became too animated, and sometimes they seemed too tense. Some even heard them arguing, but no one paid much attention to it. Over time, the relationship between Elizabeth and Tyler became even more mysterious. They spent a lot of time together, but this time was shrouded in some mystery. Tyler often locked himself in his room, and his grandmother did not allow anyone to enter. This caused bewilderment among the neighbors, but everyone attributed it to Tyler's teenage nature and possible problems in their family that no one knew about. The community in Ridgeland was tightly knit, and word spread quickly. Some said Tyler was a troubled teenager who gave his grandmother a lot of trouble, while others said they had an unusual but strong relationship. No one knew the whole truth, and no one could predict how it would all end. As police began digging deeper into Elizabeth's family history and her relationship with Tyler, they learned some disturbing details. Tyler was an introverted young man whose behavior was sometimes questionable. At school, he was considered strange, although he did not enter into open conflicts and was not seen in anything criminal. Teachers and classmates described him as an intelligent but introverted guy who preferred to spend time alone. However, some of his acquaintances noted that he often seemed nervous and even aggressive, especially when it came to his family. The relationship itself between Elizabeth and Tyler gradually turned into the main mystery of the case. An autopsy revealed that Elizabeth was not only attacked, but murdered with extreme brutality, leading detectives to question the killer's motives. Tyler remained one of the main suspects, and police increasingly focused on his role in this tragedy. The deeper detectives looked into their family history, the more questions arose. Why did Tyler move in with his grandmother? What really happened in their house? And could this young man, whom many considered problematic but kind, commit such a terrible crime? These questions still remained unanswered, but the investigation gained momentum, and every new day brought more and more information. Journalists and local residents continued to discuss the case, each trying to find their own version of events. Articles began to appear in the media about the secret life of Elizabeth and her grandson, but no one could say what was really hidden behind their seemingly ordinary relationship. The city was plunged into an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, and it seemed that everyone was waiting for the moment when the truth would finally come out. With each new day, it became increasingly clear that this matter was far from being as simple as it might seem at first glance. The picture of an ideal small-town life began to come apart at the seams, and more people wondered, how well did they really know their neighbors? As the investigation continued, police detectives began to unravel the hidden layers of Connor's family life. Secrets that once seemed unremarkable began to come to light, revealing that beneath the surface calm lay deep emotional wounds and forbidden relationships. It turned out that the tragedy that rocked Ridgeland was just the tip of the iceberg, and there was a much more complex and dark story behind this horrific murder. When detectives began looking more closely into Tyler's past, they discovered that his move to live with his grandmother was no accident. A year before this incident, Tyler was living with his father, Thomas, and his new wife in a small suburb of Houston, Texas. At first, everything was fine, but then Tyler's behavior began to change dramatically. He became withdrawn, conflict-ridden, skipped school, and spent more and more time alone. Quarrels with his father and stepmother became more frequent, and at some point, Thomas realized that he could not cope with his son. He eventually decided to send him to his mother, hoping that the quiet life in Ridgeland and Elizabeth's care would help him find balance. However, as it soon became clear, Tyler's problems were much deeper. Detectives discovered that he was in bad company in Houston and had even been involved in several minor crimes. In addition, psychologists with whom he consulted at the insistence of his father noted that he showed signs of serious emotional disturbances caused by childhood trauma and family problems. At school, he was called a problem teenager, and he often clashed with classmates and teachers. But it was in Ridgeland that his behavior began to take on an increasingly strange and disturbing character. Elizabeth, on the one hand, tried to provide her grandson with as calm a life as possible, but on the other hand, she was faced with his outbursts of aggression and isolation. Conflicts increasingly occurred in their home, But Elizabeth never asked for help, trying to cope with difficulties on her own. As the investigation deepened, detectives began to find more evidence that the relationship between Elizabeth and Tyler was not ordinary. Neighbors and acquaintances noticed oddities, but still did not attach much importance to them. Now, in light of what had happened, these oddities began to take shape in a frightening picture. At first, these were just small details. Tyler's rare visits to the city, his reluctance to communicate with his peers, strange conversations that were sometimes heard from the house. But then more serious evidence appeared. It turned out that Elizabeth regularly took her grandson to the doctor, but never told even close friends about the reasons for these visits. No one knew what these consultations were connected with, and why she so carefully hid them from outsiders. One of the doctors contacted by detectives hinted that Elizabeth was deeply concerned about Tyler's condition, but refused to reveal details, citing medical confidentiality. However, detectives were able to find out that Tyler had been diagnosed with serious mental disorders, and that Elizabeth was desperately trying to help him. As detectives continued their investigation, shocking new details began to emerge. Some witnesses said that Elizabeth and Tyler spent more time together than was customary in ordinary families. They often walked around the city, always holding hands, which seemed strange to many. But the most shocking discovery was made when detectives gained access to Elizabeth's personal diary. Her notes, which she kept over the years, revealed her deep affection for Tyler, bordering on something much more serious. These recordings showed how Elizabeth tried to fight feelings that she herself considered wrong, but could not ignore them. She described her inner torment, the fear that her feelings could ruin her life and Tyler's life. She couldn't cope with the fact that her love for her grandson had ceased to be just a grandmother's affection and turned into something much more complex. These diaries opened the detectives' eyes to the fact that the relationship between Elizabeth and Tyler was far from what society imagined it to be. They became a key element of the investigation, allowing police to understand exactly what happened on that fateful day. Further analysis of diaries and interviews with neighbors showed that Elizabeth and Tyler may have lived in their own closed world, where reality mixed with fantasy and passion. These revelations shocked even the most experienced detectives. What began as a simple murder investigation turned into an exploration of the human psyche, intertwined destinies and secrets that should never have surfaced. As police officers and city residents digested this new information, it became clear that this story had a long way to go. The tragedy in the Connor house was just beginning to take on its true proportions, and many more unexpected turns and discoveries lay ahead. Ridgeland was plunged into an atmosphere of general shock and bewilderment. No one could understand how this could happen in their quiet town. It seemed that each new fact only added layers to this dark and confusing story. As the investigation deepened and new shocking facts came to light, detectives began to realize that they were faced with a much more difficult task than just finding the killer. The story they uncovered was so complicated and painful that at one point it seemed as if finding the truth would be impossible. However, pressure from society and the need to establish justice forced them to move forward. The first step to resolving the conflict was to examine the relationship between Elizabeth and Tyler. Elizabeth's diaries, which revealed her deep and forbidden attachment to her grandson, became central to understanding what happened in their home. Police experts studying these recordings concluded that Elizabeth was in a state of deep emotional crisis. Her feelings for Tyler had long outgrown the boundaries of ordinary family relationships, and she tried to fight it. But in the end, she found herself trapped in her own emotions. At the same time, Tyler, as it turned out, also experienced strong conflicting feelings. As a teenager with an already unstable psyche, he found himself in an even more difficult situation. He was aware that something was wrong in his relationship with his grandmother, but he could not find a way to express it or understand it. Moreover, his dependence on Elizabeth intensified this tension. He felt that he could not leave her, but remaining in this situation was becoming unbearable for him. Detectives began to suspect that it was this emotional instability and psychological stress that may have led to the tragedy. But concrete evidence was needed to confirm their guesses. Then investigators turned their attention to the last days before the murder. Interviews with neighbors, as well as footage from surveillance cameras installed in the area, provided a clearer picture. Tyler left the house less and less, became withdrawn, and his behavior became increasingly strange. Neighbors recalled seeing him walking around at night, muttering under his breath and sometimes reacting sharply to ordinary questions. The key point was the analysis of Tyler's phone calls and messages. A few days before the murder, he was actively corresponding with someone who, according to the police, could be his friend, or even a casual acquaintance. This correspondence was of an alarming nature. In it, Tyler hinted at his fatigue and the fact that he could no longer live in such conditions. He talked about the fears and pressure he felt, and how he felt like he was on the verge of a breakdown. This information prompted detectives to take a deeper look into Tyler's mental state. Psychologists were called in and began studying his behavior and previous medical report. It was revealed that Tyler had previously been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which explained his mood swings and erratic behavior. He suffered from depression and attacks of aggression, which apparently worsened in the last weeks before the tragedy. The collected data began to form a complete picture. Detectives concluded that Tyler may have been driven to despair by his condition and his relationship with his grandmother. Tension accumulated in his mind, which ultimately led to disaster. However, the question remained: how exactly did the murder happen? Was this an outburst of uncontrollable aggression, or was everything planned in advance? In search of an answer to this question, the police continued to study evidence from the crime scene. Signs of a struggle were found in Elizabeth's house, indicating that she had resisted. But there were other details that indicated that the murder may have been the result of a long and painful conflict. Detectives examined the crime weapon, a kitchen knife, which was found next to Elizabeth's body. Tyler's fingerprints were found on it, which virtually ruled out the possibility of involvement of an outsider. However, the most shocking discovery was that the knife had been thoroughly cleaned before it was left at the crime scene. This suggested that Tyler may have been trying to cover his tracks, or he was in such a state that he didn't even realize what he was doing. Interviews with Tyler's friends and acquaintances also confirmed that he had shown signs of a mental breakdown in recent weeks. A friend of his, with whom he had been communicating in recent days, admitted that Tyler complained to him about his life and talked about how he needed to change something, but never mentioned his intention to kill his grandmother. This supported the theory that the murder could have been the result of a sudden and uncontrollable emotional outburst. The police realized that the matter would not be simple. Tyler was arrested and charged with the murder of his grandmother. His condition at the time of the crime and subsequent behavior indicated that he most likely did not fully understand what he had done. The issue of his mental health became central to his trial. The Ridgeland community found itself divided upon learning of the details of the case. Some considered Tyler guilty and demanded punishment. Others pitied him, believing that he was a victim of his own mental problems and difficult relationship with his grandmother. The case caused heated discussions in the media, and every day brought new revelations that further inflamed passions. Meanwhile, detectives continued to collect additional clues and evidence. Their task was to prove Tyler's guilt or, conversely, confirm his innocence if they could find other explanations for what happened. The trial promised to be long and complex, and its outcome remained in doubt. The mystery surrounding Elizabeth Connor's murder grew deeper. The police and residents of Ridgeland waited with bated breath for the outcome of this story, hoping that justice would prevail, and they would finally be able to learn the whole truth. The trial of Tyler Connor has become a major event for Ridgeland and the entire area. The courtroom was packed. Everyone wanted to see and hear how this dark story would end. The case, which began with a tragedy in one house, turned into a trial that revealed many layers of human passions, psychology, and family secrets. The court hearings lasted several weeks. Prosecutors presented all the evidence they had collected, trying to prove that Tyler deliberately killed his grandmother. They relied on data about his mental state, instability, and previous conflicts with Elizabeth. The main line of accusation was the version that Tyler was driven to despair by a long and painful relationship with his grandmother, which led him to commit a crime in a state of passion. The defense, for its part, focused on Tyler's mental state. Lawyers insisted that he did not realize what he was doing and that the murder was the result of a sudden mental breakdown caused by the pressure and emotional trauma he had suffered for a long time. Doctors and psychologists testified in court that Tyler suffered from severe depression and bipolar disorder, and that his behavior at the time of the murder could not have been conscious or intentional. One of the key moments of the trial was the testimony of Tyler's friend, with whom he corresponded a few days before the murder. The friend confirmed that Tyler was under severe stress and said that he could no longer live in this situation. However, he also noted that Tyler never directly stated his intention to kill his grandmother, but rather his desire to end the dire situation in which he found himself. Elizabeth Connor's diaries also played an important role in the process. Defense lawyers used them to show that Tyler was under enormous pressure and could not find a way out of the situation. These recordings revealed how difficult the relationship between grandmother and grandson was, and how different it was from what others saw. This added even more layers to the case, demonstrating that Elizabeth herself was in a deep emotional crisis and could not adequately evaluate her actions. After several weeks of deliberations, the jury returned its verdict. They found Tyler guilty of murder, but with the caveat that the crime was committed while in a state of temporary insanity. The court took into account his mental state and the difficult circumstances in which he found himself. Tyler was sentenced to a long period of imprisonment in a psychiatric institution where he was supposed to receive the necessary help. This verdict caused a mixed reaction in society. Some believed that the sentence was fair, taking into account all the circumstances of the case. Others believed that Tyler deserved a harsher punishment for taking the life of the man who loved and cared for him. Regardless of opinion, the trial left a deep mark on the life of Ridgeland. Residents of the city for a long time could not come to their senses after what happened. The case has left many wondering how much they really know their loved ones and neighbors, and how important it is to pay attention to the signs that could warn of impending tragedy. The tragedy at the Connor house has become a symbol of how hidden emotions and secrets can lead to devastating consequences if help and support are not sought in time. Over time, the Tyler Connor case became one of the most discussed and controversial in the history of Ridgeland. It reminded everyone that deep inner conflicts can be hidden behind external calm and well-being, and that sometimes it only takes one wrong step to destroy an entire life. Tyler continued his treatment in a psychiatric institution, where doctors and psychologists tried to help him cope with the consequences of the tragedy and find a path to recovery. But the wounds this story left will stay with him forever, as will the people of Ridgeland, who will never forget how their town went from quiet and peaceful to a place of fear and sadness. The fate of Tyler and his family was a reminder that the human psyche is a complex and fragile mechanism that requires attention and care, and that sometimes those we love and rely on may be the ones who need help the most.